on today's episode.
But part of it, too, is still supply and demand. We can wipe out all the drug cartels, but if John still wants to get his fix, he'll find a way to get a fix. So we got to work with John. So if Mary still wants to have an abortion, even if we stop Planned Parenthood from performing all abortions, she's still going to get her abortion. In other words, the real evil here has to be ministered to in the heart of Mary.
Welcome to the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. People today face many opportunities and struggles when it comes to issues of life and death, marriage and family, health and science. We're here to bring a fresh biblical perspective to these issues and more. Join us now for Life Challenges.
Hi, and welcome back. I'm Krista Potratz, and I'm here today with Pastors Bob Fleischman and Jeff Samuels. And on today's episode, we are going to talk about Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood is an organization, probably we'll kind of get into it here, but we really wanted to talk about just how it started, the history behind it, kind of just as pro-life Christians, what we should know about it, and just maybe the future of Planned Parenthood too. So, Bob, can you get us started here today on just maybe, maybe just generally, I know you had kind of brought up this topic. Why discuss Planned Parenthood?
Planned Parenthood has always had a niche in the abortion debate as being the largest private supplier of surgical abortions in America. And as a result, they've always been on the radar of every pro-life organization, and every pro-life politician is always looking to target Planned Parenthood. I have two experiences with Planned Parenthood before I really got to understand what they were all doing. First has to do with when we were pregnant, carrying my oldest daughter, Jen, and we were about 7.5 months into the pregnancy, and we were taking the birthing classes at the hospital, and the last class had a representative of Planned Parenthood come in. And I always thought that was a little bit bizarre because we haven't quite delivered the first one yet. And we're already talking about how never to let this happen again. And very nice lady. I can't recall anything she taught us, but there was nothing offensive about her. She was nice. That was my first experience. And I was aware already at that time that Planned Parenthood had kind of gone to the forefront on abortion issues. All right, so now we jump ahead to 1983-84. I was in my assignment parish out of the seminary in Plymouth, Wisconsin, and the Sheboygan County Board was going to be allocating mandatory family planning funds, and they had targeted those funds to go to Planned Parenthood, which is what probably a majority of the counties were doing because they had to provide these services. And so Planned Parenthood is standing at the front of the line saying, we can do that. And I was aware of the fact that up in Brown County, they were able to get Planned Parenthood out of that budget at that time because they had a bunch of nurses who were willing to do it. Okay, so I violated one of my upbringing rules that my parents had taught me, and that is, can't be a critic unless you're also part of the solution. And I had all of my critic arsenal in hand, and I had no solution. But I showed up at the county meeting. And I tell this, those who've heard me speak, I tell the story, and it goes like this. I showed up, and the place was packed. And I thought, wow, there's just this undercurrent of activity and zeal to protect unborn children. We're going to get rid of Planned Parenthood and everything. And what I didn't realize is on the agenda, Marcus had a drive-in theater, and there was a proposal to convert it into a dog track. And, of course, everyone was worried that it was going to torpedo their property values. And so they had so many people in there, they couldn't get them all in the room. They were out in the hallway and everything. And so they did what any good board would do, and that is, well, we'll table this meeting for this matter to another time. With that, the entire crowd emptied out, and the only two members of the audience left were two ministers. It was me and a Presbyterian minister who sat on the Planned Parenthood board. So, I got up to the microphone. I just said, we got to protect unborn life and all that kind of stuff. And then the Presbyterian guy come and gave all the usual pitches. And then, of course, I was asked, well, what do you have in his place? And all I did was I said, well, check with Brown County. That was all I could do. And if you know anything about, and I didn't know anything about working with boards at that time, but if you know anything about working with municipal boards now, and that is you better have a solution in mind, because otherwise you're expecting them to do it all. So either way, it was a classic wreck, classic fail. But that was my experience with Planned Parenthood. Since then, I've done a lot of research into Planned Parenthood. There are organizations out there that exist to tell you all the other organizations that support Planned Parenthood so that you can boycott them. And I'm not a fan of boycotts, but there's that facet of it. Planned Parenthood has evolved its program from its early beginnings of just focused on birth control for women. Married women, by the way, they began quite, I think if Planned Parenthood were to begin today, I think it would not even land on the radar of most Christians. Margaret Sanger, back in the 1915, 1916, who's the founder, she was concerned that there were a number of poor women coming in who were bearing children who couldn't either care for them or their body couldn't sustain multiple pregnancies. And her own mother died young. And the feeling is that Margaret Sanger blamed too many. She had, I guess in the span of 22 years, she had 18 pregnancies and 11 children were born. She had 7 miscarriages. And Margaret Sanger was a nurse. And so from a nurse's perspective, this bothered her deeply. One of the things that I would want to point out is that, and we make a big mistake on this on both sides of any issue, and that is there is no single issue that ever crops up in a vacuum. There is a multitude of attending issues, and perhaps one of the issues that attended this goes back to 1873 and the Comstock Law, which the Comstock Law was a series of regulations that not only prevented using the Postal Service for mailing pornography and things like that, but it also regulated, birth control. And remember also 1916, which is considered to be the start date for Planned Parenthood, that in 1916, if we're talking about regulating birth control, we're talking about regulating male birth control. There really wasn't a lot out there. There were no hormone pills. That didn't come out until, the 50s and early 60s. So we're talking about primarily barrier methods, and the primary tool was condoms and things like that. So it was an interesting uphill battle for what Sanger was trying to do. But what helped her is she came in at the cusp of the eugenics movement, which got its beginnings in the 1880s in England with Francis Galton. And with the eugenics movement, which again started off, I think relatively benign enough. It was, we first of all don't want too many people, we don't want a population explosion, we don't want to wear out our resources. That's kind of where it started. And if we have to limit population, we'd rather have the smart ones, the good-looking ones. We don't want the dumb ones, and we don't want the ugly ones. And that's kind of, Francis Galton was able to sell that. And it came over to the United States. Indiana was the first state to attempt forcible sterilization. And you could probably hear more on this if you go onto our eugenics podcast. We reviewed some of it. But it was in that melting pot that Margaret Sanger, wanted to start some sort of service to help married women understand that there's a way for you to be sexually active with your spouse and not get pregnant.
How you mentioned too, even the eugenics movement and just things, sometimes they start almost innocent enough. Like, too, if we're thinking of like the 1916 or the early 1900s and the poverty of the time and the like infant deaths or just that type of thing too. I mean, you can think, and maybe not, of course, at that time too, not really understanding postpartum depression and that type of thing. And so it's like, okay, maybe it just this innocent type of setting that like we really do maybe try to care a little bit about health or women's health. Now I know like Margaret Sanger, I mean, they're probably beyond, just caring about women. I mean, there were probably some topics or just different things in there that were not the best way of thinking about things too. And I think that kind of came out more as the history of Planned Parenthood developed.
Yeah, I mean, there's Margaret Sanger gave a presentation at the Women's Auxiliary meeting of the Ku Klux Klan at one point. I mean, it was pretty clear that she was targeting certain groups, and
Right.
American blacks were the primary focus of that, but also immigrants, and this is just American history. A much larger percentage of the immigrants who started coming in after, say, 1900 were coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. Those people whose parents had emigrated or ancestors from Northern and Western Europe generally thought of the people from Southern and Eastern Europe as deficient, defective. And so we may not be able to stop them coming in through the borders, but once they're here, we don't want them reproducing quite so much. It's funny, some of the same things that people are talking about with immigration debates today. It's this idea of replacement. So all these people are coming in and they're going to replace us because they're reproducing much faster. And so, yeah, as Bob was saying, about Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood came in with that. But, with this eugenics, yeah, there is that surface level concern that you say, well, okay, that's, even if it's not great, it's understandable, it's not so bad. But once you start taking it to its conclusions, okay, what does this mean? We want the best. Well, that means we don't want those who aren't the best. Well, how do we get that to happen? And how do we push this on them, but not on others, and things like that?
The other thing to keep in mind is that being in favor of eugenics was fashionable back then. Margaret Sanger probably got some of her important initial seed money from John D. Rockefeller III. He was encouraged by his wife to support this kind of upstart family planning type organization. And that occurred in 1924 and 1925. John D. Rockefeller gave like $5,000 and then made a second gift to them at the encouragement of his wife. And if you read a lot of the early writings of Sanger, horrible, like what Jeff's terminology that you could never use on radio. In fact, if we used it on this podcast and somebody tried to stick it onto YouTube, I'm pretty sure it would get blocked. I mean, she used terms, which is why Planned Parenthood today tries to distance themselves from it, which, in fairness, if we can be fair to Planned Parenthood on this one, and that is almost all the long-term institutions going back to the turn of the century, going back between the 18 and 1900s, had some sort of involvement with eugenics, the big ones, because the big funders of eugenics were all the big millionaires in America. They were very much behind it. And then, but there's another side of this too that kind of comes out, and that is, those of you familiar with International Harvester. International Harvester was the project of Cyrus McCormick, and Cyrus McCormick I think he had 7 children, and child number 2 and child number 7, Mary and Stanley, both were diagnosed with what today would be called schizophrenic. And Catherine married Stanley, not realizing this problem. And then the condition started showing up and getting worse and worse and worse. And she was concerned not to have schizophrenic children. And so she had heard about this Margaret Sanger and very much bankrolled a lot of what she did. And Catherine McCormick is credited with pretty much bankrolling much of the development of the first hormonal birth control. But you begin to tie money with high-profile people to a movement like Planned Parenthood, and you've got a lot of traction, and you can get away with saying things that you probably couldn't if you were a much smaller kind of upstart organization. Mm-hmm. And so it's hard to find some of her earliest writings, and some of them are extremely offensive. And you can't imagine how anyone would want to identify with it. But if you just remember that the statement, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough, was not the statement of somebody like Margaret Sanger. It was a statement of a Supreme Court justice. It was the way people talked back then, and talked about people with deficiency. So they constantly saw the birth control movement, in my view, based on my research, began with a concern for just wives who just were having more children than they can handle.
And, I think too, with Planned Parenthood, it started, right, actually as the American Birth Control Society. And then they changed the name to Planned Parenthood, I believe. Was it sometime in the 40s or something? I guess my question then is, when did abortion really start to be part of their model?
From my reading, Bob can correct me if I get something wrong here. It really wasn't until Sanger herself was no longer at the head of the organization that the shift started happening. That in the 1950s, they got their first medical director, and then in the 60s, they got a new director, head of the organization. And that was all that basically coincided with the rise in the use of antibiotics and other medical advances, many of which came as a result of World War II. And basically what that meant is that where previously women who went for surgical abortions had to go to people, they always, the cliche is the back alley, abortionist or whatever, but still, these were not doctors' offices. These were not hospitals. These weren't clinics. And so the chances of an infection or some kind of complication were much greater. But then with all these advances, they were saying, hey, women can now get surgical abortions, and we've got all the things that are necessary for them to have a good outcome from that, medically speaking. But you know what? It has to be in a doctor's office or in a clinic or a hospital where doctors are in charge. And that was then something that Planned Parenthood got behind, and they worked with doctors and medical associations and things like that to do that. And that's why they were very much behind some of the pushes that brought abortion to the fore. One of the interesting things about the connections, and Planned Parenthood was very much involved with the getting the Griswold case to the Supreme Court which was just 1965. And that was a birth control case. But that was also the case which brought forth this idea of a right to privacy, which isn't in the Bill of Rights, but it was basically something that the Supreme Court in that case said, well, no, this is something that exists that needs to be protected. And it was on the basis of that right to privacy that the 1973 Roe v. Wade case turned, that basically said, well, no, government can't interfere with this because this is a private thing. Although another one of the interesting things is that if you read Roe v. Wade, it's all about the right of doctors to perform abortions, that you don't want to get in between a woman and her doctor. Whereas today, the language is all going to be about a woman's right, to make her own choices and such. And it's the doctor thing is really not a part of it anymore. But yeah, so basically Planned Parenthood saw that the future was with abortion, because they'd largely won the birth control. And now this became the thing that they're going to push and that they're going to, put their efforts behind. And sometime in the 70s, I suppose, is when you'd say that they started making money off of abortion. Yeah. And that changed a lot of the motivations and such.
In 1955, what Jeff was talking about, Mary Calderon was the medical director for Planned Parenthood, and she convened a conference of medical professionals to talk about abortion as a reproductive choice. And part of the issue is, remember I said at the outset that none of this occurs in a vacuum. Abortion had been practiced in various forms by that time, probably for a century. Let me just to help everybody along, get the book History of Abortion in America and read that, and you'll get you find out if you just thought abortion showed up in 1973, you're in for a rude awakening. So a year before I was born, they were already talking about abortion in 1955. The thing that's interesting is hormonal birth control, where a woman now could actually take active measures. And I don't want to get raw on this, but I often sense when I'd read the literature that if a man decided he wanted to have, relations, it was, he kind of just ran everything. We're going to do it now. We're going to have relations. And a woman had nothing to protect herself either from getting pregnant or anything. And that you can see why somebody like Margaret Sanger was trying to take care of that with some sort of development of birth control. So the first birth control pill came out on June 23rd, 1960. And it was a hormonal birth control. And it had already been used early on just for women who were having trouble with uncontrolled menstrual cycles. And so they began to find that the added benefit was that I'm not getting pregnant. So, of course, you have a lot of people saying, well, I'll prescribe this to you for your menstrual cycles, when people were getting prescribed for as a form of birth control. Well, the early hormonal birth control contained some harmful elements that were tied to breast cancer and so forth. So that got modified. But it was kind of like Planned Parenthood both caused and fell into circumstances. They caused the circumstance by focusing the emphasis on a woman's right on birth control or right to procreate. And then they fell into it and forced it too by also funding. But the time was right. We had all of these people coming back World War II, other attending conditions. There were a number of soldiers who returned from World War II who had children while they were fighting overseas. All of this kind of further victimized women because the fathers of those children deserted them, came back to America and stuff like that. And don't anybody get me wrong. I know right now it sounds like I'm a Planned Parenthood sympathizer, and I surely am not. But the point is that before we jump to harsh conclusions, there's more to the history where they dig their own hole. They do it by exploring abortion. It's occurring. It's not always safe. Let's have these medical experts. Let's talk about it. One thing leads to the other, and they form, or the Guttmacher Institute's formed. It kind of operates out of Planned Parenthood, and then it becomes funded by them. Then they ended up breaking it off, but it has a very pro-abortion leaning on their research, so you remember that every time you read the material. But there just is a variety of things that starts opening the door for what Planned Parenthood can get into. So when abortion came to the docket, it came to the states in the late 1960s. When it came to the Supreme Court in late 71 or into 72, for Planned Parenthood, we were in the right place at the right time. And like Jeff said, they latched onto it. They continued to target poor areas because that was where Margaret Sanger's heart originally was. Poor, underserved women. They're the ones who are suffering the most. They don't have the diets for healthy pregnancies. It's harmful to them, harmful to their children. Then that's also why abortion clinics started coming up, because we are dealing with failed birth control. You're dealing with women who are not using birth control. So it was like a natural step for them to go into it. And remember that the large umbrella that's overshadowing all of this is the umbrella that we're asking, what do I want? No one's asking what does God want or what is right, but the whole climate of the United States had taken some dramatic steps towards the me culture. And so in the me culture, we took, which arguably some could say victimized women, and then it became magnified to the point where the victimized women sometimes would make decisions to create another victim, which would be the unborn child, who would lose its life in an abortion. And but that's where it's like going to the Griswold case, this articulated right to privacy. This is manifestations of progressivism, where your morality continually evolves and you make progress towards a higher good, which has its roots very strongly in evolution. So Planned Parenthood just was, it really was the right organization at the right time to create the right amount of havoc.
Nowadays, with Planned Parenthood, I mean, I guess I've heard like Abby Johnson and people that have worked there talk too, just about how it's really a money-making machine, especially with abortion. And I know, I mean, I'd kind of like to talk a little bit too about the government's role in providing money and funding and stuff as well, because it really seems to have erupted really into this big money-making organization. It's very large now.
Yeah, it's something a lot of people don't really think about is that just because an organization is technically and legally a nonprofit organization doesn't mean that there isn't money making going on.
Except at CLR.
Yeah. If you have an income stream, part of your nonprofit organization, that money goes somewhere, and it may end up going to the CEO and to the directors of the clinics and bonuses to the counselors who bring in X number of abortion clients per month or something like that. So there is definitely a profit motive that I'm not going to say it's going to be there for everyone, but it is something that is real and needs to be taken into consideration there.
I see it a little bit kind of like Goodwill. Goodwill, there's a lot of money in Goodwill, and there's the CEO of Goodwill makes a really large salary. I think a lot of us think of it just like a charity. I know I gather things up and take it down, drop it off at Goodwill, or if I find a help center nearby or supporting other causes, I go for that. So Jeff's point is valid. You can't help, if it didn't begin as a profit motive, you can't help but develop a profit motive when you become dependent on it. When you begin to allocate a piece of pie of your budget to anticipated income, either coming in through payments coming from insurances or from government agencies for providing abortion services, or clients providing it. Once you begin to start plugging it into your budget, unless you're only using that money to build buildings or capital expenses, you begin to rely on it, and it becomes a motive. You can't, I challenge anybody to tell me, oh yeah, it's never a motive. Of course it's a motive. Making money isn't what makes it wrong. It's what you're doing makes it wrong. And that's where where we start getting into problems with Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood today has got its tentacles in a variety of things, and they're extremely well structured and organized. As an administrative guy, I'm impressed by how they have their program broken down into like 3 parts and the areas of focus. They have a whole area focused on political developments and stuff like that. That's how it works, and that's also how you stay in the business they're in.
Yeah, and Bob's example from early in his ministry just illustrates one of the reasons why they are entwined with government in so many ways. If they're the only game in town for providing certain services to low-income women or something like that, and the government has money to spend on that, well, then it's going to go there. But there's also the political cycle. Planned Parenthood is very active politically. They have their goals, whether it's advancing abortion in one sense or fighting attempts to restrict it in the other side. But if the government gives Planned Parenthood money, even if that money is specifically earmarked, well, no, this can't pay for abortions, but pays for something else, then Planned Parenthood can turn around and use basically the same money, even if it came in from one pot, it's still all the same pot, to lobby the government to give them more money. And it's something that's really not supposed to happen in a proper democratic system or whatever. But it just means that Planned Parenthood is able to use its vast sums, and it's also able to do an awful lot of fundraising to get its preferred policies and its preferred candidates out there, who then, if they get into office, that's going to come back to Planned Parenthood. And it's also the matter, while Planned Parenthood is not the only game in town in terms of being and providing abortions, they're the vocal one, they're the visible one. And if you work in the government and you're in favor of abortion, you're generally going to be in favor of Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. And so, that's going to be reflected in terms of contracts being awarded and things like that.
Planned Parenthood has done a good job, or just, a job in general, of trying to show that they do more than abortion. And that is one of the arguments I hear or people sometimes say is, well, they provide a lot of services for women or they do a lot of different things. How would somebody kind of combat that a little bit, or what would they say in response to something like that?
Well, in the first place, the truth is that since, as we mentioned already, since the 1970s or so, Planned Parenthood has been about abortion. That's been their thing. And though they talk a lot about other services that they provide, those are just a drop in the bucket in comparison. Now, there was one point they were saying, well, abortion only counts for 3% of what we do. But when people looked into the numbers that they were using, it's like, no, it's actually more like 60 or 70%, because they were separating out the one specific thing of surgical abortion from all the things that anesthesia for the surgical abortion and the room for the surgical abortion, they were counting those as separate from abortion costs. But, I will say they are branching out a little bit now from abortion, and that they're getting into providing drugs for people with gender dysphoria who want to transition to another sex. So they're getting on top of that one. But a second thing is that even if we were to take their claims about offering so much more than abortion at face value, that still does not remove the moral outrage and evil that is abortion. To claim that one kind of canceled out the other, or we should ignore the bad thing because of all the good and that would be like arguing that a serial killer should be praised and supported for being a really good worker, a good neighbor, and a good friend, and that murdering all those people that he wasn't so good to, that just doesn't matter because he did so much that was good. We wouldn't accept that as a reasonable argument. And why would we accept it then about Planned Parenthood, even if they're not only doing abortions?
So as Christians, then, what is the takeaway really from doing an episode like this and looking at it? Is Planned Parenthood really the real evil here, or is it something else?
It's the hearts of people. I mean, it's always been the problem with the hearts of people. When I saw your questions, on this episode, what do we do? And I know some members of our own church body who work for Planned Parenthood. They'll work in clinics and so forth, and their argument is, it's the mission field or something like that. I would have a real problem with that because I am so appalled at terminating any human life that I don't know if I can be part of that. But part of affecting change is you got to be able to reach the heart. And the way you reach the heart is you got to establish a relationship. And I know that, people could be, protesting outside the abortion clinics. And I think there's a place for that. And I think there's some effectiveness to it. Some lives have been saved and so forth. But it is hard to get to the heart. And I think that, there could be as equally strategic as they are. For example, if back in the early 1980s, Brown County was able to create a network of nurses who were willing to provide this service, then it gets Planned Parenthood out of that. Now, the interesting thing is you have to remember, pro-life Christians don't want to be in any position where you're dispensing any form of birth control that might have an abortifacient element to it. So already that creates a problem. If we're only dispensing barrier control or natural family planning method or something like that, then pro-life Christians can be part of that. But all of a sudden we get to be a problem if we're going to be dispensing hormonal birth control, which still has a third mechanism. It's still listed as a potential abortifacient, that kind of thing. So you're always going to have a problem with that. If you're Roman Catholic, you're going to have a problem with it, period. I mean, if it's birth control and if it's not natural family planning, you're not going to do. So in other words, the law requires that the service be performed on the county level. And you have an organization here that lacks the ethical foundation to see the problems of what they're doing. It does create a practical problem. But part of it, too, is still supply and demand. We can wipe out all the drug cartels, but if John still wants to get his fix, he'll find a way to get a fix. So we got to work with John. So if Mary still wants to have an abortion, even if we stop Planned Parenthood from performing all abortions, she's still going to get her abortion. In other words, the real evil here has to be ministered to in the heart of Mary. And that's where I think we got to go. It's the harder approach, but it isn't nearly as much fun as the political battles and the protests and all that kind of stuff.
Really, I think there's quite a bit more too we could say on this organization and this topic in general, and we'll probably touch it again in the future too. But thank you for all of this information today, and we thank all of our listeners. And if you have any questions on anything we discussed today, please reach out to us at lifechallenges.us. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back next time. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. Please consider subscribing to this podcast, giving us a review wherever you access it, and sharing it with friends. We're sure you have questions on today's topic or other life issues. Our goal is to help you through these tough topics, and we want you to know we're here to help. You can submit your questions as well as comments or suggestions for future episodes at lifechallenges.us or email us at podcast@christianliferesources.com. In addition to the podcasts, we include other valuable information at lifechallenges.us, so be sure to check it out. For more about our parent organization, please visit christianliferesources.com. May God give you wisdom, love, strength, and peace in Christ for every life challenge.